I have the pleasure of introducing Angie Trudell Vásquez, who's the Poet Laureate of Madison. And as I always do, I'm going to go off script a little bit and say that when I met Angie just a few weeks ago, a month or so ago, again at one of Loud's events, the art parties that are held here in Madison, and I had the position of saying, yeah, we were going to be in person. It was going to be 50-minute programs and so forth. I'm sorry, you only have 18 minutes, kind of like a TED Talk or whatever. And Angie, you're muted. And I was delighted with Angie's response, which was, I always wanted to do a TED Talk, which completely helped me get over my angst about that. So Angie's got her own small press. I'm going to give you the time to introduce a little bit of yourself as well. I think that one of the things about the Poet Laureate program in Madison, which is one of the first Poet Laureate programs anywhere, is my understanding. We were the first, if possibly the first city in the country that went that route. So we have a number of years of being able to do this, and that's really been a privilege. So you are also, Angie, active in terms of publishing other people, working with people in terms of what there is to get their own voices out. You have a collection, you're on your 4th collection of poetry right now. And she's going to tell us a little bit about how she found support. I'm going to say that I think poetry is absolutely a universal language, and in our current milieu, people often don't recognize that. And when you hear somebody like Angie, you just realize it's not rarefied. It's not something for a small audience. You really reach people, and I find it to be very, very exciting to hear you, and I appreciate it. So I'm going to hand it over to you. Say warning about if you get towards the end. I honestly am having a good time letting our speakers go as long as they can with the time that we have. So I see you on. I am not hearing you. I don't know if you're on mute.
Jan, can you hear me?
Yes, I can now.
Okay. So thank you for that introduction. And I am going to start with a poem because I want to ground us in ceremony. And we're going to start with our literary and our actual ancestors in this poem. And it's called Identity. And this is a poem that I wrote for my family. Identity. White Mexican looks like a Latina, not my label. A question from a Guatemalan student who's come undone in my ESL class. Doesn't get my kind. I try to describe how I grew up in Caucasian corn country, surrounded by houses on cul-de-sacs that looked all the same. How we were alone in a town of 5,000, one Black family, one Indian family, one Asian family, and one household of Mexicans, no, 2, us and the Renterias, to whom we were related by marriage before and after my divorce, and they were mixed. Still, it was a good living, happy in our cocoonness, our oneness, separated by money one direction, color on the other, classes, day and night we took lessons, piano, jazz, tap, ballet, the dance team, trumpet, trombone, tennis, finishing school, and one awful summer golf. Christian, confirmed, catechismized, it all cut me in several places, molding of head and heart, making me ultra-sensitive then and now, an observer of the outside, an outsider among my own kind, my very shade, mysterious, aloof, black-haired beauty who can't speak Spanish, living among blue-eyed, dyed, blonde bombshells who held up her head higher because she's shy, not stuck up. Understood, undenied, sacrificed to at any price, but my beloved little parents, who taught me well, gave up so much so their daughters could shine, and they'd swell with pride at the life they had given us. On Sundays, we basked in mutual admiration after Mass, singing our church songs while making breakfast, according to the unspoken doctrine in our house of fast first, eat later after communion. We intruded with our Mexican music, bellowing out the open windows, the smell of bacon frying, pancakes baking, coffee and eggs scrambled to order. It wafted out on beautiful summer mornings out of our house, perched on the highest spot one could reach on the east side of the street for first and second generation immigrants. I used to write down the date I wrote every poem, so that's from January 25, 2001. And that can be found on the poetry website. That is actually pre my MFA. And I wanted to talk about what makes a poet and how I became a poet. And it was actually a children's book. My parents read to me nightly, and the book was Frederick the Mouse by Leo Leone. And Frederick's a little mouse, and he's a poet, and all the other little mice are gathering food, but not Frederick. He's absorbing colors and sounds. And in the winter, they ask him, when all their food's gone, what about your stores? And he reads them a poem. And the poem makes them feel warm and well-fed and celebrates their little lives. And I thought, that's what I want to do. I want to create that through words. So that was the first journey. And then I convinced my paternal grandmother, who didn't speak English very well, to buy me this red faux leather diary from Uptown. And she did. And I remember making that first entry, and I have all my journals and all my writings from the age of 7, which is the age at which I started. And I found myself on the page. I really did. As a young Mexican-American girl, a Chicana, in a community that's 99% white, I needed to find a way to define who I was and understand my experience. So that was through poetry. And I teach that now. I do identity poems with people, with students, with young people. And oftentimes it is a way for us to connect, for them to have some self-love, for them to understand their place in the world. So for me, it's really important that we do identity poems. And that is one of them, but it's not the first one. And I continue to write these poems. As a young child, the library was a gift. There were so many riches in the library. And I had this thing where I would go pick out the thickest book in the library and walk around with it, you know, feeling all proud because I've got this big book. And that's how I read Tolstoy at the age of 12. Did I understand it? No. But I had read Tolstoy, and then I came to the Russians, and I thought, this is so wonderful. I really feel them. And then I found Duende by reading the Spanish and Latinx writers. So there's so much out there. There's so much richness. But I read a lot, and I wrote a lot. And, you know, being a child, you have bedtimes, right? Well, for me, that meant hiding under the covers and reading and writing. So this is how I came to be a poet who writes really fast. So I did a lot of reading. And I think about us being the sum of our ancestors, but also our literary ancestors, and every song and every book and every movie that we've ever read. It's all part of who we are. And there's this great history of literature. And I always think about how good art begets art. And that's really true. I don't know how other people became artists, but I know how I became an artist. I did study creative writing and literature in college, and that was great. And I'm going to read a poem that I want you to just reflect on. I read the earlier poem, but one of the great things about poetry is you can bring people's stories out. And this is called My People Redux. And this is the title piece for my new collection that's coming out in January 2022. My People Redux. 1, crossed rivers and high deserts before water jugs littered parched lands. Rode motorbikes, carried komals, seeds, black and white photographs. Fought poor villagers on their homelands, went from high school to the front lines. Lessons on patriotism led to flag burning, alcoholic stupors, streaking, a roll of the dice, heads I live, tails I leave. My people forgot they rose from the earth. 2, our great grandpa knew. He planted corn rows, praying while he weeded and walked between his crooked lines, singing to the clouds to come, lay their rain music down, drum a new rhythm, tap the green stalks to grow. He wove a footpath from the back door to the smallest plant, whispering its name, and fed his family with what he wrought from earth and aqua sky, what he coaxed between loam and hard copper hands. 3. His kind fingers twist off pears, peppers, slender green beans, husks of sweet corn, crab apples, and peaches, what the white-tailed deer did not nibble. Bees buzz in their hive, lured by the burnt man who croons at dawn, by his wife who brings him pan dulce and black cream in the morning in her pink house dress and potato sack apron. Leather patched by sun in scarecrow clothes, muscle clings to his bones, never young. Family, a heavy wool blanket that covers his sins in the heat. Blessed with grandchildren, they run in his rows, bring him books he cannot read, pages telling a history he corrects after cartoons each day. 4. Great-grandchildren search for his buried grave, armed with spades and hoes, so they know where they came from and can find their way back to the original place of green grace, mountain breath, stews cooked with seeds woven into a young girl's black braid, sewn in the hem of her deer dress. That is my People Redux. And I think about how we can time travel in poems, right? We can bring in our history, our people, our culture, where we live, and we can weave this into something that is beautiful and profound and share that with others. And when I write, I seek only to connect. I went back to get my MFA in my late 40s, and I had been an organic poet for this time, but in my 20s, I started publishing, and I was a Ruth Lilly Fellow, and had no idea what that meant for many years, and now I do. And I've been a literary citizen wherever I lived, in Iowa, in Washington State, in Milwaukee, and in Madison. And the moment I moved to Wisconsin, I started traveling back and forth between Madison and Milwaukee and Chicago. And I attended readings and conferences and art museums, and have participated as a community artist, always teaching, devising poetry workshops for my old employer that I took to Seattle, that I took to Washington, DC, that I have taken all over the country, and I've taught others. And like the speaker before me, I've been working with youth for a long time and mentoring young poets. And these poets are now going out and doing their own work. And I think about how we can grow and heal ourselves in poetry. And a friend of mine said once, we're healing backwards. And I think about that sometimes, and how poetry and art can heal us. And when the other person spoke, I was thinking about generational joy. If we have generational trauma, we have generational joy. And there is so much richness in our lives. And I think poetry helps us keep those things present, right? When I work with young folks, I ask them, who's the poet in the room? And they'll raise their hands. I'm like, and do you write poems for the births and deaths of your family? And inevitably they do, because we're like the keeper of the stories, right? So I'm going off a little script, but I might skip a little. But I do want to say, like, to me, poetry is this beautiful thing we have, and it might be the original basis of all art. When you think about before we had written languages, we had poems and songs, and these became something we had to put on paper and tell other people how to perform, how to read, how to sing these works. And so we became democratized through the printing press, and poets and songwriters had to figure out, how do you make it look on the page the way you want it to be heard or read? So this is a long time coming, all of this work to this moment. What else can I say? I've had a really great time being a poet. I recommend it. You need a day job though. You really do. I don't know any poets who just make it on their art. I mean, yes, you win a prize here and there, and maybe if you're Joy Harjo, the US Poet Laureate, you can do it. But most of us have day jobs. And I think that's important too. And I've long been an activist in my work, and I weave this in my stuff. And you'll hear a piece later where I have some of my personal work life history in a poem, but I'm not going to read that right now. If you want to be an artist, you've got to put in the work. I edit my work over and over and over again. The pieces that you've heard have been edited many times, some pieces up to 50. I like to put my work on the wall and walk around it and figure out the inner architecture. I studied Indigenous poetics at the Institute of American Indian Arts with some of the best Native American writers in the country and in the world, actually. In fact, if you were to watch Reservation Dogs on Hulu right now, some of those writers are from the school I went to. So if you know young people who want to study their craft, send them to art school. I waited for a very long time to go to art school. I went at the right time for me, but it's been a wonderful ride. It's 10:17. I want to keep talking, but I also want to read some poems. To be a literary citizen, to encourage people to do that, you got to go where the poets are. I used to call myself a poet groupie. And in my 20s and 30s, I started going out to hear poets, and I got to hear Gwendolyn Brooks, and I got to hear Lawrence Ferlinghetti and Galway Connell and Carolyn Forche. I want to take a moment and say, as an undergrad, I came on the term poetry of witness. And the book, The Country Between Us by Carolyn Forche, has had such an impact on me. And that is one of the things I think poetry can do, is provide a witness to what's happening, especially now as we're going through these times. Poetry can help us remember, and it can honor, and it can just help us get through. Let's see, what else? If you want to write, look at the writers that you admire, who published them, look at their readings, study their work, mentor others, share your knowledge. Don't be the poet in the room who's jealous. Be the poet who celebrates everyone's victories, because to write a poem and share it is a beautiful thing. Write with your heart, don't write with your brain. And I find to be a poet, sometimes you don't always know where you're going. You don't know where the poem's going. It may be nothing like what you thought. I do think there's discovery on the page. I practice first thought, best thought. I do that when I teach as well, because maybe we have 5 minutes. So we practice first thought, best thought. We just write what we have and we share it later. But it is the editing that to me is the real writing now. And that's where I find my greatest joy. It's not so much the inspiration I feel now, but the work behind it. And I love the editing work. So I'm going to close with one poem, In Light, Always Light, and then I'll take Q&As. And I obviously could talk about this a lot longer. And I kind of threw away my script that I spent so many hours on, because I wanted to make sure I had enough to say. But I always do this. I overplan, and that's okay, because I wanna do the honor, and I want to show up. And so this is In Light, Always Light. And I write for the people in our community. My first foray into the community was living on the Far East Side on Sinnington. I would watch the children race down the hills. And that poem, Wheel Kids, is one I read quite often. But this one is another one for the children in my neighborhood. And I live by Radar Hill. And so many of the poems in this collection, In Light, Always Light, and my People Redux, are from this neighborhood. So this is our community. In light, always light. And this is also my philosophy. I have hope. I know things are hard, but I am alive and I have hope. In light, always light. Grass strands gleam, weave, undulate from the window. The vendor screams, build the wall, lifts his hand, works the crowd, looks at me, sells more t-shirts. My mind waxes, brilliant wet glass winks, waves shine back my reflection. I am dazzled by the sun glinting off my cat's whiskers. He lays on his back, flanks splayed by the deck, half shade, half light. First graders play football on marigold carpet in our shared backyard. The smile on their faces when they catch it warms us, childless apartment dwellers behind glass walls. The poet reads a book of poems and walks to the park to think. She does not know what she is going to do, hike the sled hill or swing on the swing. If no children are present, she will swing until her stomach says no, then descend from her height among the treetops and head home. She circles the preserve, full of earth thoughts, falling leaf music, crashing, crushing sounds, and auburn smells float up from her footsteps. She thinks. We spin on Earth's axis, half blinks of history. Thank you so much. Thank you for being here.
Thank you. I'm always a little speechless with when I hear poetry that really speaks to me. And I appreciate your shout out to Carolyn Forche, who maybe didn't, she certainly didn't start a movement but she certainly brought it to more people. And I remember very vividly being in that presence. What is your next step as a poet laureate and as a poet, Angie?
Well, yes, it's quite a life, right? To be the poet laureate and then the poet and then have the day job and be a wife and a sister and all that, right? Great, yeah. So for the poet laureate, I'm going to talk with the library later today over my lunch hour. I have these poet lunch hours, poet power lunch hours, and we're going to talk about some projects. So we just finished judging a poetry contest for young folks. I was one of many people. So that is on the agenda today. But I have duties and I have poems to write and read, and I'm going to be bringing a poet on December 7th who I don't believe has read in front of the city council. So that's really lovely. And I'm hoping the mayor will ask me to write another poem. So, maybe to close out the year. That would be really cool. Yeah, so that would be for the poet laureateship. And I'm also serve as the chair for the Wisconsin Poet Laureate Commission. So I help select the state poet laureate. And so for me personally, I have some work to do. I'm the new chair, and that's a big responsibility. But, we went from Margaret Rosga being the poet laureate for the state to Dasha Kelly Hamilton. So really very exciting times for the state of poetry in Wisconsin. Really exciting times. If you don't know those poets, check them out. My friend Peggy told me, Margaret Rosga, that she's writing the best poems in her 70s. And I'm like, yes, I'm going to retire. And then I'm going to write even better poems. Because I want to say, like, you only compete with yourself, right? Don't compete with others. But if you can keep getting better, that's fabulous. I need to wrap up my book. I've got some blurbs I need to share. My People Redux, I need to sell books, and that's always a thing. Like, poets are great at writing, but do we really want to be salesmen? Not so much. So I got to do that. And I've been asked by a publisher for new and selected work. So I'm starting to figure out, what do I want to come out and of my other collections, and what pieces that are out there that have never been in a collection that I would like them to have more exposure. So I've got some work to do, and I'm writing another side book on the history of us humans. How did we come to be? Because I'm mystified about where we are now, and I feel like we can evolve and we can be better humans, and poetry is a vehicle for that. But I also want to understand. So I'm reading a lot of history and anthropology and just anything I can get my hands on early humans. I'm all over right now. Yeah.
I also go off script a lot, so I'm going to do that. Somebody just submitted a new question that I really like. Does your day job fertilize your poetry, and are you able to empower the people that you work with to write or otherwise express themselves? What a great question.
Well, I just wrote a piece this week for my day job, and I do work in a nonprofit, and I've been very fortunate with both of the nonprofits I've worked for the last 20 years that they have a teen component. So I can do poetry workshops for the youth programming. So that's wonderful. I did Indigenous Poetics last year for the Teen Summit, which was amazing, pulling out the best Indigenous writers, because that's my specialty, is Indigenous Poetics. But being able to pull the Indigenous poets of Wisconsin and say, this is your heritage, look at these poems, and now let's write some. But I wrote a piece on domestic violence and honoring folks from the Courage Award through DCF. And it was a big, long piece. It needs some work, but I'm trying to get over my ego a little bit, Jan, and share work that's not 100% polished. So I put it out there and it's being shared. But yes, I do write poems for our work. I wrote poems on politics as well. I'm very politically engaged individual and always have been. I grew up in a family that was very politically engaged. So the work does feed it. And I do like working in nonprofits for mission. I really believe in missions. So I have my own missions, right? Which is to write poetry, to heal the world, to make a better place, to, compel people to understand one another and build connections through empathy. Yeah, and cross-cultural understanding. Yeah.
We have just a couple more minutes. Can you talk a little bit about, if you had to do it over again, would you do it the same trajectory? Do you even feel like it involves planning to do that?
Well, okay. Yes, I do have, and I wanted to talk about this. Like getting an MFA is a very important thing, but I went at the right time. But one thing I will tell young writers, there are many first book contests. Be careful about self-publishing your early collections because you may miss an opportunity for first book prizes as a young poet. Because there's all these literary prizes out there and many of them are first book. But if you publish too thick of a first or second collection, you put yourself out of the running for those.
Right.
Yeah. Yeah. So be careful where you choose to publish and where you send your work. Yeah. I wish I'd been a little more careful about that.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
And how did you find your voice originally in terms of writing? You spoke a little bit about that. I'd like to hear.
Yes. Well, being a child of second and third generation Mexican immigrants in Iowa growing up, it was through poetry and writing that I found my voice. And oftentimes in writing, I figure out that what am I thinking? I don't know until I put the pen down. So there's a lot of discovery for me. So it was through discovery and writing and automatic writing that I figured out who I am, which was like a strong feminist poet as a young person who was very aware of class and race and ethnicity and the history of this country and where I fell in and where my family fell in. So there's a lot of discovery. So, growing up with a lot of strong female and male, I guess, examples, we were early activists, I could tell stories about that. And in fact, I have a poem that was selected by Poem a Day called In the Discount Lot that'll go out to 500,000 people in November, which is about one of our first actions, me and my sister, with the Chicano House during the lettuce boycott. So I've been trying to write that poem for 10 years, Jan. It finally came together and it was finally accepted. So, yeah, finding your voice, I think, is really important. And I think poetry is one of the ways, just like through earlier, we saw many musicians, right? Finding their voice through that, which I've had the honor of performing in front of those young, wonderful artists. So I encourage people to find their voice and tell their own story and write their own poem, because they will do a much better job. Yeah. I think everyone has a story to tell.
Yeah, I think, that makes sense. I hate ending these conversations because I kind of want to keep going, but I will track you down at another art party perhaps and corner you and say, okay, here's my other questions. Thank you so much. And congratulations on your TED Talk.
Thank you, Angie.
I'm gonna start switching over to our next speaker now, but thank you so much.
Thank you, Angie. Thank you, Jan.
Thanks everyone for being here.